Sometime in the future, an earthquake could explode across New York City. If a major earthquake does hit New York, there could be mass chaos.
I foresee considerable difficulties for the fire department and the police department.
Thousands of brick and masonry buildings could suffer extreme damage.
The consequences could be devastating.
Experts may disagree on the size of the quake, the exact location, and how imminent the threat, but everyone agrees that earthquakes can happen here. And if they do, the results can be catastrophic. New York is not the first city that comes to mind as being at risk for dangerous earthquakes. But just a few miles below the New York City area lay several earthquake faults. 125 years ago, the New York area was hit by an earthquake.
The largest earthquake that we know of historically in New York City is the 1884 earthquake, roughly magnitude 5.
August 10, 1884, an earthquake rumbled up from underneath the Atlantic Ocean. The epicenter of the quake was 17 miles south of City Hall off the coast of Rockaway Beach.
We're here on the Coney Island beach, on the fringes of New York City. We see on the horizon another peninsula. That's called Rockaway. And Rockaway is the closest point to where the earthquake occurred in 1884. And it shook not only the beach here, but all of New York City.
10 o'clock in the morning, unprepared citizens across the city were shocked to find themselves grabbing for walls, calming startled carriage horses, and ducking from falling bricks as the whole city shook. Thousands of chimneys in the city were broken in the magnitude 5 quake. Parapets came down, windows were shattered. Luckily, there were very few injuries and no fatalities. The earthquake created ripples on the surface of the Connecticut River 100 miles away. The East Coast from New York south to Maryland and north to Vermont was rocked by seismic waves, an area covering roughly 70,000 square miles. In fact, in terms of seismic hazard, New York City is the fourth most at-risk city in the country, following San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Seattle. People sometimes confuse seismic hazard with seismic risk, but they are not the same.
Because risk is really not only defined by the natural hazard. There are two more ingredients that go into risk. Hazard is one. The other is the value of the assets that are exposed to that hazard. And there is plenty of valuable assets concentrated in the New York City metropolitan area.
The third ingredient is the vulnerability, or what is sometimes called fragility of those assets with respect to the hazard, meaning seismic shaking and other seismic hazards.
In this area, roughly every 100 to 150 years, a magnitude 5 occurs. Magnitude 6 is in the order of 1,000 years. Magnitude 7 are almost beyond imagination, but they can unfortunately occur.
Seismologists use a numerical scale known as the Richter scale to quantify the power of earthquakes. Charles Richter and Benno Gutenberg determined the magnitude of an earthquake could be calculated based upon the amplitude of seismic waves recorded by seismographs. Each whole number increase in magnitude represents a tenfold increase in measured amplitude. In other words, a 5.0 magnitude earthquake is about 10 times the amplitude of a 4.0. Since 1737, at least 6 earthquakes of magnitude 5.1 or higher have struck New York State. The 1737 quake was also centered near New York City. But New York is not alone. One of the earliest recorded events took place over 250 years ago in Massachusetts. An earthquake estimated to be magnitude 6.0 to 6.3.
For the northeastern part of the United States, the earthquake that really defines what we think the earthquake hazard is the 1755 Cape Ann earthquake. We think it was centered just east of Cape Ann, Massachusetts. That earthquake did major damage in Boston, in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Portland, Maine. It was felt up to Halifax, Nova Scotia, felt down as far south as Winyaw, South Carolina. The estimates are about a third of the chimneys in Boston were damaged or destroyed by that earthquake. If that earthquake were centered near New York City, it would be even worse.
Other East Coast and Midwestern cities have been devastated by killer quakes.
There are clusters of earthquakes in the Carolinas, South Carolina, North Carolina, around Charleston in particular.
On August 31st, 1886, just 2 years after the 1884 earthquake in New York City, a massive earthquake ripped through the coastal city of Charleston, South Carolina. Estimates based on damage patterns and historical records put the Charleston quake at magnitude 6.5 to 7.3, similar in size to the Los Angeles quake in 1994 and the Loma Prieta quake in 1989 that devastated San Francisco. Witnesses to the 1886 quake reported that sandblasts from liquefaction shot up all over the area. These sandblasts occur when water pressure builds up underground. When the pressure is released by seismic waves, the fluid comes shooting to the surface. These fountains of water can sometimes shoot as high as 30 feet into the air. More than 2,000 buildings were damaged in Charleston. Losses totaled more than $6 million, about $122 million in today's dollars. Between 60 and 100 people lost their lives. The Charleston quake was felt as far north as Manhattan, as far west as Omaha, Nebraska, and as far south as Cuba. Over the next 35 years, more than 300 aftershocks were attributed to the earthquake. But there are more recent reminders of devastating earthquakes along the East Coast.
I was 18 years old at the time, and like I say, it was an event that I will never forget.
Just after midnight on a July night in 1944, a magnitude 5.9 earthquake erupted in the sleepy town of Messina, New York.
It was the first major earthquake that this area had experienced.
We had gone out to celebrate our graduation. There was a few of us that went out to the local bar and had a few beers, and about 12 o'clock we closed the place down. Then we decided we'd better get home. It was a very, very quiet night. You could hear a pin drop. I stepped in the door, put my foot on the first step, and bang, the earthquake hit.
I woke up feeling as if there was a freight train going very fast past the door of my room, and the bed was shaking.
I could hear dishes rattling.
Just like that somebody picked you up and shook you.
I think every other person on the street was out in the middle of the street in their pajamas and robes.
The earthquake ripped through Messina and across the border into neighboring Cornwall, Ontario.
The fault runs from the northwest to the southeast across the river and through the towns of Cornwall and Messina. The next day, I think the full force of what had happened hit. People were wandering around the town like zombies.
A school building came down, and many chimneys were damaged. Brick walls were broken by that earthquake.
The two small towns of Messina and Cornwall suffered more than $2 million in property damage, about $50 million in today's dollars. 90% of the brick chimneys were destroyed, and brick masonry and concrete structures suffered severe damage. Plumbing and house foundations were ruined. Large cracks formed in the ground in nearby Hogansburg, New York. Property damage in Cornwall, Ontario was especially bad.
They seem to use, for some reason, a lot of brick and mortar over in the Canadian side. We have brick houses in Messina, but nothing like they do over in Cornwall.
The Messina earthquake has been closely studied by East Coast seismologists and others as an example of the kind of damage a smaller earthquake can do in an area of mainly brick and masonry buildings.
The Messina earthquake was interesting because it showed what an earthquake that is not quite 6 can do to the type of construction that we still have a lot of around in New York City.
Oh, I think in a metropolitan, heavily populated area, it would probably be a real disaster.
One of those kinds of earthquakes centered right near one of our major metropolitan areas, like Boston or New York, would cause significant damage.
The 1944 quake did no damage in New York City. Next time, the city might not be so lucky.
Everybody thinks of Manhattan and the skylines and the business district. Well, New York City is a big collection of small towns. So we will have many of the effects that we saw in Messina of buildings collapsing or at least severely damaged.
Earthquakes continue to rumble under the city to this day. Could the next New York quake do more than just rattle the city's nerves? In recent years, earthquakes have continued to shake buildings right underneath Manhattan's streets and sidewalks. Just 1 month after the World Trade Center attack in 2001, a magnitude 2.6 earthquake centered right at 55th Street and 8th Avenue rumbled up from the earth. City officials were initially concerned there had been another terrorist attack.
Mayor Giuliani was very concerned that an explosion had gone off somewhere in the sewer system in New York City. Well, they couldn't find, of course, where that explosion was going on because the earthquake occurred 5 miles beneath the city, near Central Park, actually.
We had an earthquake back in January, very similar kind of thing. Made noise, shook a little in certain places, not in others. People probably reacted more to this one because of the events of September 11 and then the things since then.
These mini-quakes are nature's way of reminding us that if the big one comes rumbling up through the earth and rips apart one of the largest cities in the world, the death and destruction could be enormous. The earthquake history of New York and the rest of the East Coast could have been very different. The metropolitan area has a geological history that is as diverse as the city itself.
New York City has one of the most interesting geologies, from very, very old to the very, very recent.
Scientists have learned a great deal more about this ancient geology from a relatively new field of study, plate tectonics.
We learned in the second half of the 20th century that the way the Earth works is basically by way of the theory of plate tectonics.
Plate tectonics is the geological theory that there is a layer of plates or rock covering the globe that is in a slow but constant drift across the surface of the Earth. In other words, the surface of the Earth is not fixed, but is in constant motion, like slow-moving bumper cars that periodically collide with one another. These plates generally extend out and under the sea around the world's land masses. The North American plate extends roughly from the western edge of the United States all the way east to the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean floor.
So most earthquakes occur at plate boundaries where the plates rub against each other.
An earthquake is a sudden slip of the two sides across a fault. So the rock makes a movement suddenly and releases stress.
This rubbing at the western edge of the North American plate where it meets the Pacific plate has resulted in a long history of devastating earthquakes. But there are key differences between earthquakes that happen at the edge of a tectonic plate and those that happen in the middle of a plate.
Within the center of the plate, it's more of the squeezing kinds of earthquakes that build mountains, as we have, for instance, in the northeastern United States.
Most famous in the United States is the New Madrid area in the central United States along the Mississippi River Valley. They are in the New York and in the Boston areas, and all the way up to the Canadian border in the northeastern United States.
About 220 million years ago, a fused continent known as Pangaea, comprised of several of our modern continents, began to break apart.
So Westchester County and much of New York City for a moment thought it would go with Africa. And then it had second thoughts and stayed with us.
We've been spreading away from Europe and Africa ever since.
In the wake of this upheaval, the modern North Atlantic Ocean appeared.
And now New York sits right on the edge of this continent.
Near the end of the last ice age, 10,000 years ago, the New York area and the rest of the East Coast experienced another significant set of geological developments.
Some 10,000 years ago, the glaciers started to slowly retreat. But what they did before they left, they polished everything clear, and they carved out the weakest spots in the rock.
The glaciers carved deep valleys along the underlying fault lines.
These black lines here are the most active faults now in the modern geological time. The most prominent of them is the 125th Street Fault that runs here.
The 125th Street Fault is clearly visible from its valley-like geology.
The glaciers hollowed out the shape of Manhattan to follow those fault lines, and that's why we have actually these shapes of Manhattan.
If there is a slip along one of these faults, devastating seismic waves could be released up to the Earth's surface.
A seismic wave is very much like when you drop a rock into the pond and you see the ripples going out.
The first seismic wave initially stretches and squeezes the rock. The other seismic wave is the shear wave that bends the rock sideways. It is this second wave that gives us the horizontal shaking that causes so much damage to buildings. Seismic waves on the East Coast travel farther than they do on the West Coast.
At the edge of the plate, there is so much earthquake activity going on that it shattered the plate. So it's a little bit like your windshield that has a lot of cracks in it because someone threw a stone in it. And there's still light coming through, but you can't see through very clearly. The same thing with the seismic waves, where those plates are broken by prior earthquakes. The seismic waves go sort of through, but it's not very clear.
In the middle of the North American plate, where the rock is clear or less shattered from previous quakes, the seismic waves can propagate without being diminished. This is very much the situation with New York City's geology.
It turns out that the waves propagate more efficiently and cause more damage for a given size earthquake than the equivalent magnitude earthquake in a plate boundary region.
Here in the eastern United States, we can feel earthquakes as small as magnitude 1. Certainly magnitude 2 are widely felt all over New York City, for instance. Californians have no clue that there was a magnitude 2 earthquake. So if a 3.5 or 4 occurs here on the East Coast, everybody is up in arms. Californians say, okay, we had a 4 today, this morning, and keep drinking their coffee.
But even a moderate shaker could cause extensive damage to New York. What can the city and its more than 20 million inhabitants do to safeguard themselves from another earthquake emergency? Next on Mega Disasters. If a major earthquake should hit New York, Vulnerable building types and varied geology could be a dangerous mix waiting to combust. One of the most dangerous components of this deadly brew is a geological phenomenon known as soil liquefaction. Klaus Jacob takes us down to New York City's shoreline for a demonstration.
Now, I'm the skyscraper, and that is the Earth. Now, the whole thing is shaking. So liquefaction is when a firm sand that's water saturated gets shaken up by an earthquake. That earthquake pumps the water around between the sand grains until they lose their strength. When that happens, the sand cannot support any buildings anymore. The buildings sink in and tilt over. You get the idea. Look, that's how soft it is compared to here. It's really hard.
The 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake that struck San Francisco, magnitude 7.1, was a tragic example of liquefaction. Before 1906, there was no marina district in San Francisco. After the 1906 quake, a swampy area downtown was filled in with debris from the earthquake and covered over with dirt. Houses were built, and the area became a popular neighborhood. 83 years later, when the next major earthquake hit, the loose soil caused tremendous damage in the district.
The problem is when you fill these areas with sand and dirt, they will shake more strongly than the nearby rock areas, kind of like shaking a bowl of Jell-O.
Liquefaction could severely harm similar landfill areas in New York City.
The problem is the type of infrastructure, the type of buildings, the value that we have in that one area create a large risk, and the consequences could be quite great.
As history has shown, even a magnitude 5 earthquake could severely damage thousands of buildings. Risk analysis experts estimate that if a magnitude 6 earthquake were to strike in the same location as the 1884 quake, over 20 million people would be affected. Property damage could be in excess of $84 billion.
We're talking some serious damage here.
And according to a panel of scientists and experts, including FEMA, the New York State Emergency Management Office, and other private and governmental agencies, thousands of people could be killed, and the enormous economic infrastructure of this urban region could be devastated. A larger quake could do even more damage.
We estimate that in a worst-case scenario, something like a 7 magnitude earthquake, over 30 million people will be impacted by the event.
According to the report, an even larger magnitude 7 quake that hits New York in the same location as the 1884 earthquake could kill more than 6,000 people. 13,000 more could be injured. Why would a magnitude 7 quake cause so much death and destruction? The answer has much to do with how cities such as New York have been constructed.
There are many of the old unreinforced masonry buildings, what we call brown stones, that are mostly built at the late 19th century and the early 20th century, when New York City and Brooklyn and parts of Queens were in rapid expansion. It's a very, very vulnerable building type that is very dangerous to the people that live in it during an earthquake.
But before one can consider the terrible destruction above ground, there is the specter of what lies beneath New York City's pavement to investigate. A major metropolis like New York requires an incredibly complex underground infrastructure.
There's a whole world underground.
Power lines, water lines, gas lines are always susceptible to ground shaking from a major earthquake.
There are also sanitation canals that carry away wastewater and steam pipes delivering heat to large buildings.
There is a whole spider network of stuff going on underground.
Ironically, you may be safer underground during an earthquake than you would be standing in the middle of 42nd Street.
Generally speaking, you are better off underground because the amplitude of shaking diminishes as you go deeper into the earth. It's safer to be underground than above ground or in a building that sticks way out and shakes.
A vivid example of this occurred during the deadly Mexico City earthquake in 1985. Soil liquefaction destroyed hundreds of buildings. But below ground, the subway system was almost unscathed. Within hours, subways were up and running around the city. But there are vulnerable spots underground in New York, particularly where different infrastructure systems intersect. Water mains may break. Flooding in previous storms has already proven to be a problem in subway tunnels that are nearly 100 years old.
There are sewer pipes that are very brittle. Many of them are cast iron. That's a very bad material to respond to an earthquake.
Moving back above ground, one sees the biggest danger posed by an earthquake: buildings. In 1995, New York City finally adopted a seismic building code. This was a major step in making all new construction safer from earthquake damage.
The biggest difference that we would have now in our seismic building codes for the eastern part of the United States is the requirement for stronger connections so that if a building gets pushed sideways in earthquake shaking, the connections don't break. So if you have a vertical beam and you have a horizontal beam, the horizontal beam will now be attached more strongly to the vertical beam so that if it shakes, you don't break the bolts or break the welds and have the beam come down.
Bridges and pre-code buildings will be a major problem if an earthquake hits New York. But there could be other disruptions in the aftermath of this terrible disaster. Fires, fallen debris, and broken elevators could trap residents inside and under buildings all over the city. In the first hours and days after the quake, an already chaotic situation could get even worse. A major challenge for older cities on the East Coast in terms of earthquakes is bringing building codes up to date.
The building codes for cities like New York or Boston generally apply only to new buildings. By not reinforcing old buildings, we always take the chance that the earthquake will occur before that building gets replaced with a new building. And that's a major concern in our eastern cities.
The most stable-looking structures are often the most vulnerable.
The biggest problem that we have with large brick structures, like maybe a school building built in 1920, maybe an old fire station, or a factory, a warehouse. The brick is very massive and very strong in the vertical direction. It resists gravity very well. The problem with earthquakes is the strongest earthquake shaking is sideways. And brick does not want to bend very much before it cracks.
Skyscrapers have different structural issues during earthquakes.
You might have more than 50 stories of building weight that has to be sitting on the foundation. The ideal case is to get the foundation pillars and posts and support to go all the way down to the rock.
For the most part, the top of a large Manhattan skyscraper is a safe place to be during an earthquake. Steel-framed skyscrapers have been engineered to withstand 100-mile-an-hour winds. This gives them a level of flexibility that will help in an earthquake.
And then we have one other important category of buildings. These are the flat plate high-rise buildings that are lightly reinforced concrete. They are slabs, floor by floor, with vertical concrete reinforced columns. And all these different types of buildings have different vulnerability to earthquake. They respond differently.
Another hazard to New Yorkers will be debris falling from buildings. Air conditioners, rooftop water tanks, cladding, and decorative elements could cause tremendous damage or injury to cars and pedestrians on the streets and sidewalks below. Inside buildings, there could be problems with ceiling collapses and other fixtures like lamps and office furniture. And then there are the elevators.
New York City has in excess of 100,000 buildings. If only a tenth of them would have elevators, that still makes at least 10,000 elevator systems And probably many of the business buildings have 5 and 10 elevators in them. So you have tens of thousands of elevators.
Modern elevators are equipped with fail-safe mechanisms that prevent them from falling down.
But you have the problem that you have to get the people out of the elevators. In the meanwhile, fire can break out. So the fire department has multiple tasks.
According to emergency management experts, fire is another potentially deadly problem for Manhattan's firefighters. In a magnitude 6 quake with the same epicenter as the 1884 event, more than 100 fires could erupt. More than 900 fires could ignite in the tri-state area.
The pipes that distribute the water to the hydrants for firefighting or to buildings, that could be a severe problem for firefighting immediately after the earthquake.
But there are other potentially deadly problems that could befall some of Manhattan's newest and most densely populated skyscraper neighborhoods, areas like Battery Park City. Before the World Trade Center was built, this area at the southwestern tip of Manhattan was mostly Hudson River water. But thousands of tons of dirt dug up for the foundations of the towers created acres of new ground that developers wanted to build on. And just as San Franciscans created a new neighborhood in the Marina District, New Yorkers created their own neighborhood built on landfill.
They took the piers, filled in sand, and then built wonderful high-rise buildings. They are well engineered, but they were not engineered with earthquakes in mind.
For areas where you can't get down to the rock itself, the typical construction practice is to put down many, many pilings and just let the friction of the pilings trying to push into the soil hold the building up.
These buildings could be vulnerable to liquefaction in a major New York quake.
That's exactly the kind of material we have in Battery Park City and other places in New York City. So now we have a situation where we have very beautiful buildings, very expensive buildings, both residential and business buildings, in an area that will have amplified shaking.
Liquefaction disasters have happened before in other urban earthquakes. Niigata, Japan. A 6.5 magnitude earthquake shook the earth under this port city on June 16, 1964. The Kawagishi-cho apartment buildings keeled over on their sides like giant ships in the soft mud created by the seismic waves. Occupants of the buildings literally walked out of their windows and down to the ground below. But it's not just buildings that could collapse. There are other hazards, such as bridges and elevated train stations.
Well, we saw bridges break in earthquakes in California. These are presumably solid bridges, but we've seen them break.
The Brooklyn Bridge was completed in 1883. The unreinforced masonry towers could sustain heavy damage or even collapse in a large earthquake. In many ways, a bridge can be seen as a musical instrument. A violin has strings and a bridge. The towers of a bridge correspond to the bridge of a violin and the cables to the strings.
Now that violin makes different sounds. And the bridge also has different elements that all make their own vibrations in their own frequency or periodicity. And so the structural engineer needs to know those modes in which the bridge wants to swing and then see whether the earthquakes excite them or not to design the bridge to resist against earthquake. And that's a process that's going on right now in New York City. It has started some 10, 15 years ago.
Klaus Jacob takes us down to street level to demonstrate that engineers from a much earlier period of New York City building history were also trying to prepare for earthquake hazards.
So here we are, right smack where the 125th Street fault crosses Broadway and Manhattan.
Normally, the subway runs underground, but when the engineers tried to build the subway through the rock in the fault zone, they realized it would be a difficult challenge.
So they stayed level and built the bridge across the valley. So this bridge is there because the fault is there. The bridge is a document for the fault. And what you see here is actually a hinge which rotates like this. Why did they do that? Well, there's the fault over there, and they thought the fault would move vertically so the bridge could adjust. What they didn't know is that the fault doesn't move this way here. Nowadays it moves this way. What they should have done is do it this way, the axis, and then move around like this to accommodate the horizontal fault movement. For 1905, that's really very advanced engineering. Of course, they got it wrong, but I think they did a very good job in at least trying to accommodate earthquakes and fault motion.
But good intentions won't be enough if a major earthquake shakes New York to its foundation.
What you can see are the zip codes coded in red are where we estimate the property damage would be over $50 million in that single zip code. And the whole area affected covers a population of about 15 million people with a total value of property of close to $1 trillion.
Next, using computerized recreations, three-dimensional graphics, and historical records, we'll experience the massive destruction from a killer quake as it hits Manhattan. It has been almost 125 years since the last damaging earthquake rocked New York. That dry spell could come to an end.
It's a question of uncertainty. Maybe it'll just be a 5, and maybe 5 is a long time from now, so we're not going to have to worry about it. It's the uncertainty that makes me say, well, maybe a 6 or a 7.
With more than 100,000 buildings in New York City, many of them at least 75 years old, people in the city that never sleeps could awaken to the massive collapse of their brick and concrete home.
The idea is to think about things that no one else has ever thought about so that you can deal with the unknown.
2 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, sometime in the future. Without warning, a 6.5 magnitude earthquake shakes the 5 boroughs of New York for 35 seconds. The epicenter is under the 125th Street fault in Harlem.
When you start getting into the 6s, that's going to cause some very serious damage.
The first seismic waves rush to the surface in a deafening roar. In Harlem, within the first 5 seconds, the elevated train tracks at 125th Street strain to bend with the intense shaking. But 7 seconds into the seismic vibrations, the elegantly engineered 102-year-old structure snaps and breaks. 10 seconds later, the Midtown skyline sways and shudders from the intense shaking as the sheer waves continue to rip the ground sideways. Skyscrapers shimmy as powerful seismic waves pulse across the earth. Power goes out. At Lincoln Center, the New York State Theater starts to crack and fall apart in the powerful earthquake. The Empire State Building shudders back and forth, but its unique structural integrity keeps it upright.
It is concrete that is steel reinforced. So it's not a bad design, really, for the earthquake situation.
For many of the brick buildings surrounding it, it's a different story. Simultaneously, in Times Square, huge neon signs crash into the Great White Way, scattering taxis and pedestrians in every direction.
There will be rubble in the streets. There will be rubble on cars. There will be a lot of blockage in the street. There will be confusion.
The 59th Street Bridge sways dangerously in the seismic waves. But while the roadway holds firm at first, 30 seconds into the melee, the unreinforced masonry tower crumbles and the bridge collapses. The most spectacular calamity is reserved for Battery Park City. Here, several massive buildings hit by intense soil amplification are slowly tilting over in the mud. Fortunately, it can take several minutes for a large building to slide off-center during one of these liquefaction disasters. Just as we saw in Niigata, Japan, it's possible building occupants could walk or climb to safety from the side of the building. The earthquake comes to a shuddering stop after 35 intense seconds.
There are the moments directly after the shaking has subsided. You will find injured, you will find dead people, because a lot of material will fall down on people.
Across the city, more than 1,500 buildings have completely collapsed. 4,500 buildings have extensive damage.
On the first hours after the earthquake, you can imagine that there will be chaos. There will be fires breaking out, and there will be major confusion, of course.
As underground gas and electrical lines burst, fires will start to break out across the city. Fire quickly makes itself at home in the aftermath of an earthquake. Emergency crews and firefighters may have a difficult struggle keeping water pressure high enough to fight the fires.
Then comes the long night after the earthquake, which will put extra task on the police force to make sure that people that are in need of food will not excessively take care of themselves or call it looting.
The next day will likely bring little or no restoration of power. In a magnitude 6 earthquake, there would be more than 2 million tons of debris, or 154,000 truckloads. This is more than 9,000 times the daily debris capacity of the city. Driving and even walking around the city will be hampered for months to come.
There are a dozen points of exit around the island. And those are tough points at 5 o'clock on a delightful middle of the week day. I have a feeling that evacuation is going to be a tough one.
Evacuation for a city of this nature, in almost all real sense, it's impossible.
Some medical decisions may have to be made without the benefit of high-tech facilities doctors and patients depend on.
You can have hospitals at the fanciest places in the world. You can have the highest tech imaginable. But in the face of a disaster, you get back to basics.
The city would continue to be jolted by terrifying temblors.
There would be aftershocks that would take place afterward that can be just as nerve-wracking as the main shock, even if they're not damaging.
For a major urban center such as New York, recovery from this kind of mega disaster could take many months.
We estimate that the amount of property damage in a major earthquake would be in the order of $250 billion of property damage. But of course, you have to add to that the damage to business interruption, so that the total economic disruption in dollar terms is likely to be at least $500 billion. If it's a moderate earthquake in the 6 or 7 magnitude range, then even after 6 months, we'll be a long way from having all the reconstruction and the rebuilding complete.
Right now, this worst-case scenario is only fiction. Hopefully, increased public awareness and the stronger building codes will outpace the next occurrence of a major quake in the city.
One of the things I am feeling ever better about as a seismologist working in the northeastern part of the country is that the awareness of earthquakes is growing. We think about preparedness. We have more seismic provisions in our building codes. There are more and more schools that are doing earthquake drills as well as fire drills. So we're gradually becoming more aware and more planned for how we would deal with an earthquake if it were to occur. The problem is, of course, most people in the northeastern United States, most people in New York, most people in Philadelphia, most people in Boston don't think that they will ever face a damaging earthquake. And that is just a fallacy that we could be proven wrong on someday.